Hi everyone, my name is Samantha Rose Hill. Welcome to week 2 of Moby-Dick. I am here with everyone, and this week we are going to jump more into the text. We're going to take a look at a few of the scenes. I have a letter that I want to share with you that Melville wrote about Moby-Dick. And we'll spend a little bit of time doing some text work to take a look at some of the sentences and some of the rhetorical maneuvers that Melville is employing. Melville is employing throughout this book. One thing that I said last week, which I had not planned to say, has been lingering in my own thinking as I have been going through Moby Dick this week, which is that, I think we could read this book as the human condition. And I hadn't quite thought about it in those terms before. I think in my own imaginary, I had, I want to say, kind of siphoned it off as the great American novel, for a few specific reasons. One of them comes up in our reading for this week in the cetology chapter, in which Melville beautifully captures the kind of particularly American impulse to catalog, to make lists, and to engage in forms of definitional work. I made a bit of a joke to myself. Let me let Pat in. At the beginning of our reading group last week, when I said I'm gonna break character and we're not gonna start at the beginning, we're gonna start with chapter 1. And and the famous sentence, "Call me Ishmael," but Melville doesn't start with chapter 1, of course. He starts with an etymology. Melville begins Moby Dick with we have this etymological note here at the top before we then get into these other bits. And it says, supplied by a late consumptive usher to a grammar school. The pale usher, threadbare in a coat, heart, body, and brain. I see him now. He was ever dusting his old lexicons and grammars with a queer handkerchief mockingly embellished with all the gay flags of all the known nations of the world. He loved to dust his old grammars. It somehow mildly reminded him of his mortality. He liked to dust his old grammars. It somehow mildly reminded him of his mortality. And then we get this etymology: while you take in hand to school others and to teach them by what name a whalefish is to be called in our tongue, leaving out through ignorance the letter H, which almost alone maketh up the signification of the word. You deliver that which is not true. Whale, Swedish and Danish, val. This animal is named from roundness or rolling. Vault is arched or vaulted. Whale, more immediately from Dutch. And then we have these other notes here about different linguistic pronunciations and names for whale. And then in the cetology chapter, this book within a book that we get, there's lots of different forms that Melville is playing with in each chapter as we read through. So here we get the scientific manual, and there's lots of parallels, there's lots of juxtapositions, there's lots of, I want to almost say, north and south poles that he's holding in this kind of to create different forms of tension, whether that's the land and the sea, or between different characters, between the philosophical and the scientific, between the monotheistic and the polytheistic, And then the great underlying tension that really informs and I think provides the kind of, I want to say inner boning of the book, but the inner structure, I was thinking of corsets now, but the inner structure of the book that's holding it up is a question about how we approach the human condition, about how we approach what it means to be human in this world, what it means to live in this world, and where we find ourselves at home in this world. And so in each of these forms, many of which assume a particular literary character, we have a sermon, we have a legal argument, we have a defense of a legal argument, we have a definition of a ritual, we have reflections on mythological texts, we have 2 sections on knights and squires to introduce us to a different kind of masculine composition of who's going to make up the crew on the ship through this medieval language. There's a lot of play. There's a lot of play, but the forms in themselves, as they proliferate, become a kind of catalog too. It's not just that we get one chapter that's a catalog, but it is a catalog of forms. The writing in itself becomes a kind of catalog of forms that he's playing with in an attempt to answer a great many questions. And so, you know, then by the time when we read that first sentence, which who knows how many dissertations have been written about it, but you know, call me Ishmael. Yeah, so what I'm just going to pause there because we didn't pause there last week. You know, we started to read the paragraph and it's so hard for me to start reading and to not stop in here. And we talked a bit about this damp, drizzly November in the soul. And of course, this refrain, call me Ishmael, is going to come back to us in, you know, we don't even get to end the book at the end of the book, right? We get the epilogue. I'm doing that thing, you know, you're not supposed to do. I just turned to the last page of the book and we're still at the beginning. And we get the epigraph from Job. The drama's done. Why then here does anyone step forth? Because one did survive the wreck. So we're going to have these 2. I didn't give anything away, I promise. Then we're going to have these 2 Hill's laughing at me. We're going to have these 2 bookends of unknowing. We have these 2 bookends of unknowing. Call me Ishmael. We don't know if his name's Ishmael. We don't know. We're being told to call him that, right? We don't know who the hell this guy is. Could be Job for all I know. Could be, yeah, it's a bad joke. And then one does survive the wreck. We don't know. We're not going to know who survives the wreck either. We don't know who we're following. We don't know who's left alive. We don't know who survives. And in between, we have this intricate story, this beautiful, unfolding, thick, descriptive story of a Homeric-esque journey, right? Not from sea to land, but from land to sea, with this question of home hanging over the whole text, wrestling, maybe fishing with forms to try and answer some of these questions about what does it mean to be landless and alone? What is our place in the world? What is our place in the world? Any thoughts or reflections before I keep yammering on. Yeah, Altaz, go for it. And then Isabel.
Yeah, since you mentioned Ishmael and then you said, I mean, who is that? Do we even know that's his name and all that? I had this question as I was reading, because there are times where he's describing someone what they're thinking. And then I was like, okay, what's going on here? Because we're supposed to presume he's someone who's on the ship, who's going on this journey, and it's a bit of a stretch that he knows everything that's going on in the ship, including in all these rooms. Like he's tuning into a lot of gossip to know exactly what's going on everywhere, but is also at times describing uh, someone's thoughts. And I'm like, okay, there's some playing around going here. Who is Ishmael? So that was really interesting to hear you mention that.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't have a firm answer to that question. We can try and answer it. I think there's an invitation to answer it and an invitation to ask ourselves why we feel the need to answer it. You could start by saying, okay, we have this kind of Melville-esque narrator who is giving himself a name to take us through the text. That doesn't quite feel right to me. And yeah, so Isabella and then Catherine, then Marilyn.
Okay, I kind of have two questions. The first question is, do we care about Moby-Dick spoilers? Is that a thing I have to avoid, Moby-Dick spoilers?
I think does anybody have a strong feeling about mentioning things that happen later on in the book? Okay, you no. So we have democratic consensus.
Okay. Well, I'm worried my question is,
No,
I
do you
guess.
want to protest?
Hmm?
Okay, I thought you were trying to say something. No, go for it, Isabel.
Okay. Well, I guess it's less a comment and more of like a question of like about what you were saying because it confused me a little bit. Like the idea that we have like the Job narrative of only one survived the wreck. We don't know who survived the wreck. I found that confused me a little bit, and I feel like the um right, sorry, I got distracted by the chat. I was just a little confused by that through line of like we don't know who survived the wreck when like we do have a narrator, and I found it improbable to assume all of a sudden that he is narrating while dead. I thought it might, even if you only had the opening and the the epigram, the whatever you call them, at the end of the epilogue, only one survived the wreck, I alone and am escaped to Telpi. It seems a pretty clear implication, even from those two pieces of knowledge alone, that the survivor would be the narrator, in this case Ishmael. So I was a little confused on where you were going with not knowing who survives or who dies.
Well, so the Job comment was a little bit of a joke, but Job is a very important kind of marker for Melville here. We don't know who the narrator is. In the cast of characters that we meet throughout the text, we don't know who the narrator is. We don't know what the narrator's real name is. We don't know if it is the narrator that survives at the end or not. And I didn't read I mean, it's just a paragraph. We can read it if we want. We can read the last paragraph. I'm okay with that. But by the time Margaret says, no, don't do it. But okay, I will just say, as you read that last paragraph, the page, which I know you've done before, Isabella,
Oh, it was a
that
long time ago in my
okay,
brief life.
well,
I might have forgotten it.
it's quite beautiful, but it leaves us with a great deal of doubt about who did survive. There's a bit of a turn that happens in it that causes you, you start to think you have a sense of certainty, and then Melville takes it away. And that's the larger overarching point I was trying to make about what I believe to be one of the central questions Melville is asking us, the reader, to grapple with throughout this book, which is the tension between, in philosophical terms, we would say knowing and not knowing. And so we can think, as a kind of Homeric-esque story, we can think about Odysseus, who is the clever man, who uses his wits to outsmart the gods, to eventually get home and overcome all sorts of obstacles. In doing so, and has this complicated relationship to the gods, but he is able to figure it out. He figures it out. He gets home. And here we kind of have the inverse of that. We're not going from sea to land. We're going from land to sea. And we are on the journey of the chase, right? Being led by a kind of madman, a monomaniacal madman. And there is not this triumph of rational cleverness. There's not this kind of Odyssean knowledge, right? That becomes the kind of hallmark of Western cosmology. Instead, we're left with questions. Melville is going to leave us with questions. And I think part of, and the letter I'm going to show you comments a little bit about this, but Melville doesn't even want to lead us to God, right? This isn't, this is not even a kind of affirmation of a Western monotheistic, God will redeem you for your sins, so you can know that where you're going when you die. Right? There's something much more Nietzschean. There's something much more uncertain. There's something much more, as the word raw comes to mind, but in the sense of like an exposed nerve without the coating, and he's poking it, right?
I see.
And does that make sense?
I think so.
Yeah. It's okay if it doesn't.
It's okay.
Catherine?
Either way, I will retire so that other people may say their piece.
It's a good question. Thank you for asking it. Catherine, Marilyn, Katie?
Well, I was thinking about the setup in the story, and Ishmael is the outcast, for one. And when we're thinking about who are we, well, Ishmael's not part of the club per se. And I was thinking about as he's introducing Queequeg, also he does a lot of exposition of Native American tribes, of the sort of pagan background, in quotes, I'm saying pagan background of Queequeg. Talks a lot about other cultures in a way, so that he's giving us a sense that there are many ways of being, and some of these people will be on the ship together as well. So I got, first of all, from the American novel point of view, it was really interesting at the time that he wrote that this story takes place, there is still a very vibrant Native American culture. People are interacting with them. There's places where they used to hunt moose, now they hunt whales, So I enjoyed that part of it. It wasn't just the European civilized view there. And so I felt like that the first week we were reading was kind of the setup to, well, I'm going to ask the question about, who's really got the answers here. And here's a lot of examples of different cultures, different religions, different beliefs. And so then we're on our merry way by the end of the first week onto the ship. So that's really just a shared observation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really the the observation, Ishmael's cataloging and observations about the different religions that he encounters in the different characters is really important to the cosmology of the book. And I think part of Melville's wrestling with at least two things. One is the particular religious character of the Republic of America and those traditions. And the other is the more universal wrestling with what does it, so we're talking about the late 19th century. What does it mean? So I stole a line from chapter 23, but what does it mean to be landless and alone? What does it mean to be landless and alone in the world without God, without a place? If anybody starts singing Bob Dylan, you get extra credit, right? What does it, what's the, the quote, I was born very far from home, or far from where Terry knows the quote, I'm sure.
I'm afraid I can't help you this time, Sam.
All right, damn. Okay. Far from where I'm supposed to be, so I'm just trying to get back. And but the sense that one is trying to get somewhere, but also one doesn't have anywhere to be. Right? That suddenly, we understand how big the world is and how connected it is, or how connected it can be through colonization, through travel, through imperialism, through trade, all those things. And so Aristotle says that you determine the position of a person on a map of space by describing what is around them. And so if you get rid of the map, where do you find someone? If those lines of demarcation are drawn. I think Melville's wrestling with this larger existential question, this larger question of what does it mean, what does it mean to be a person in the world? What does it mean that we appeared here? Right? That's the great question of metaphysics. But religion gives us an answer to that question. Religions give us an answer to that question. And so part of what he's doing, in the way that part of how Melville often gets read, is that he's trying to understand this feeling in the 19th century of what it means to be a landless human being alone in the world, to be this kind of, Arendt calls it rootlessness, right? Lukács calls it rooflessness. Heidegger calls it thrownness. But the sense that, we just got cast down here, and we don't know where the hell we are really, and we don't know why we're here, and we don't know what we're supposed to be doing. And so, he's not he's not saying, well, this religion is bad and this religion is good and this one will save you. He's doing something more insidious in a way. He's saying none of it's going to save you, but they're all fine. Just pick one. Right? It's not going to save you. You want one? Have one. Take whichever one you want. You want to kiss Yo-Yo on the nose before you go to bed at night? God bless you. Right? It doesn't matter because it's not the real question. And, you know, and then this becomes part of the great symbolism of the book as well. You know, what the hell is that white whale? For those of you who don't know me, you should know I have a really terrible sense of humor. So this is how I talk. Yeah, and I'm not going to answer the question for you, but you know, I think Melville wants to take your voice and leave you howling at the moon. Marilyn?
Hi. So this may be a irrelevant comment, but I'll offer it anyway. So when you were talking about the last paragraph, the last line, I thought of some other books that I read that seem like they're similar of that period. Search of Lost Time, Man Without Qualities, Magic Mountain. They all seem to end the same way, and they seem to have a character that was similar to Ishmael or Ishmael as a performance. And I'm thinking that Melville almost presages the modern era with maybe some, if you think of the context of why, when these books were written, Melville's was perhaps at the beginning of some kind of a breakdown in American society, moving away from religion and the abolitionist slavery question was getting more heated up. And then, of course, the other three I cited. But all of the three characters, Ulrich, Proust, Hans, Korst, all seem like very Ishmaelish. So that was just my association, and it may be wrong, but that's the feeling that you're reading that engendered in me.
I love the observation. Ulrich, Hans, Marcel, Ishmael. That, you know, it's this. I would say there's one of the first thoughts in context of what we read for this week that stands out to me in that quartet is the fact that Melville feels like he has to mount a proper defense of what it means to be a whaleman. So on page 127 in chapter 24 in the Advocate, so as Queequeg and I are now fairly embarked in this business of whaling, and as this business of whaling has somehow come to be regarded among landsmen as a rather unpoetical, disreputable pursuit, therefore I am all anxiety to convince ye landsmen, of the injustice hereby done to us hunters of whales. In the first place, it may be deemed almost superfluous to establish the fact that among people at large, the business of whaling is not accounted on a level with what are called the liberal professions. And so Ulrich, Hans, and Marcel all have liberal professions in the traditional sense of that word, those terms. Hans Castor and the Magic Mountain wants to draw ocean liners and steamships, but because he doesn't think being an artist is a good enough way of life, he decides to become an engineer of ocean liners and steamships and ends up, you know, running away from life altogether. And, you know, I think, and Ulrich also goes through his various professions looking for the kind of looking for a kind of universal truth in mathematics. I think that there's a question of whether or not I don't even want to say is Ishmael doing this, but I just want to ask it as a question. Is this book about running away? Or is it about coming home? Right? If the Odyssey is about getting home, is this book about leaving home? Or is it also about coming home? Or something else altogether? So there's not the same washing off of the petty bourgeois accoutrements and comforts of everyday life, the kind of interiors of the Sunday afternoon bourgeois that we get in Man Without Qualities, The Magic Mountain, and In Search of Lost Time. This is stinky and smelly. This is men in a shoal and hot bowls of steaming clams and harpoons in bed and scalps and burlap bags. But I think Melville's also showing us how beautiful it is. But there's a question of work and honor too. I think there's also, I want to say, now I'm just thinking about the books in conversation with each other. You know, I think I have the sense whenever I read Melville, and it's one of the reasons I love him so much personally, is this book in particular, is that I think he's not trying to give meaning to life. He understands that that's a kind of narrow-minded pursuit, and that we trick ourselves into thinking that we can conquer the vastness of the universe by finding our place in it, instead of just accepting that we are of it. You know, for Melville, as he says here, Earth is already a spaceship. We're already up there. Sorry, it was a really good question. You're just making me think, Marilyn. I'm just thinking about out loud. Do you want to respond?
I think you have some good points. Maybe it's not so much they're similar, but they're reacting to something that's in the society.
Yeah.
All of the men, they're all men,
Yes.
and in their own way, they're not content to just stay in one place.
Yeah.
And it's like you said the hero's struggle. There's something about a struggle, like to find a quest of sorts, to like maybe to find an identity, to have some satisfaction of being. Maybe that's a more abstract way of looking at it, but and
I like,
I
yeah.
thinking about the world, like, you know, when Melville wrote and when those others wrote, like the influences of not the specifics, but the process of disruption and quests. And why does somebody not stay in one place, but has to go seeking? Why did Ishmael choose to do this? He said why he did, but you know, what was his unconscious motivation? So anyway, that it just reminded me of that. That's in terms of these men.
Yeah. Yeah, and in 31 we get the reference to Queen Mob, and we get it when he's introducing us to it's a bit later in chapter, when he introduces us to Starbuck and Stubb in 26 and 27. He is I think there's an appeal to the kind of medieval imaginary as well,
Mhm.
and the kinds of quests that knights would have been set upon by a sovereign to carry out a certain task as well, and maybe thinking about what it is that that definition of man as a knight looks like within the context of this whaling profession compared to that 19th century man with soft hands, right? Or Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy he has a nice line where he says something like, men used to go out and work all day and come home tired at night. And now they sit all day and, they can't sleep because they haven't actually used their bodies in any way. So there's this kind of mind-body divide that happens in the labor force as well, with the transition to an industrial capital society. But I'm thinking about the knight, and the kind of appeal as well to the knight is the man of action. The knight's the man of action. And the 19th century man, or I'll just say the modern man, is defined by impotence of action. And so there's a bit of that in there too. Katie?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I was really interested in the mast as a metaphor for the human soul and the various ways in which the mast gets described. This was in one of the later chapters that we read. The mast on land versus the mast on sea, comparing, statues and memorials. And it reminded me of the philosopher Adriana Cavarero, who had a book maybe 10 years ago critiquing rectitude and autonomy. And so I had been thinking about that, but then when you open talking about loneliness, I was also thinking about that difference between erectness and inclination in terms of how we relate to others. So I'm just curious if you have anything to say about the importance of the mast in this book going forward. And I will also say that I liked that Ahab described himself as demastified in reference to his leg.
Can I write down what was the name of the book that you mentioned, the philosophy work?
I'll put it in the chat. It's Inclination, a Critique of Rectitude, I think, by I think that's the title, by Adriana Cavarero.
Okay.
And she goes through the history of philosophy, critiquing autonomy, kind of Kantian ideas of autonomy.
Okay, yeah, no, great. I haven't read that and would like to read that. So let's see. It's Lumions, Night Squares, the spect cinder, the masthead. Here we go. So I think you're picking up on one key and recurring distinction that Melville comes back to throughout the book, which is the difference between land and sea, and what is of land and what is of sea, and what the land symbolically represents, and what the sea is going to symbolically represent. And we started to talk a little bit about land last week, I think, and what the land in itself is going to represent in relationship to this kind of historical material moment and of transition in the 19th century. So the land is closed, right? We were talking a little bit, I think, about or maybe it was, I can't remember if it was us or not, but the Land Enclosure Acts, right, at the end of the 16th century, right, and the transition from agrarian to industrial capitalism. So we get the Land Enclosure Acts. We have the expropriation of the Catholic Church and property through the Church of England, through the Reformation. And so land is closed. right? Or you can think of philosophy, you know, I have Rousseau in my head, the first sentence at the beginning of the second discourse on the origins of inequality, the first man who, having enclosed a piece of land and said, "This is mine," and found someone dumb enough to believe him, is the true founder of society. We close off land, right? That is what we do to land. We live on a piece of land, that land becomes ours, and that does something to the way we think about our relationship to where we live. We think that we own it, that we can control it, that it is our property, that it is ours, that it belongs to us. We objectify land, would be another way to say that. And then there is the sea, which is not still, but in motion. And it is open, right? The open waters. And one of the things that we can put on land, that Melville points out, that we cannot put on sea, are these kinds of landmarks, these statues, as you were saying, Katie, that are affixed to a specific place. They're affixed to a specific memory. And then we have in the, you know, we have the conversation around mast heads in 30 and 35, and the mast head, I'm trying to find a specific passage here. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, okay. So yeah, there's a few good ones in here. So I'll pull up screen share for a second. So one, it's a position of rank, it's a position of elevation, it's a position that gives one a kind of God's eye view over what they're looking at. And so there's a difference between standing on the land and looking up to the sky, and standing at the top of the masthead and looking down and having a kind of cosmic view to survey from. And that when I was at Highgate Cemetery taking a tour, and the woman giving the tour said, "Do you know what the difference between a cemetery and a graveyard is?" And I didn't know there was a difference between a cemetery and a graveyard. And apparently a graveyard, it used to be just where people were buried, attached to like a church, you know, a little plot of land. And a cemetery is a privatized graveyard that's often built on a sloping piece of land. And the price of burial goes up the higher up you get on the hill, because the higher you are in the hill, the closer you'll get taken up first. Right? The closer up you are. What's the word when the rapture happens? Is it the rapture? Anyway, okay. So in most American whalemen, the mastheads are manned almost simultaneously with the vessels leaving her port, even though she may have 15,000 miles and more to sail ere reaching her proper cruising ground. And if after 3, 4, or 5 years voyage she is drawn nigh home with anything empty in her, say an empty vial even, then her mastheads are kept manned to the last, and not till her sky poles sail in among the spires of the port does she altogether relinquish the hope of capturing one more whale. Now, as the business of standing mastheads ashore or afloat is a very ancient and interesting one, let us in some measure spatiate here. I take it that earliest standards of the mastheads were the old Egyptians, because in all my researches I find none prior to them. For though their progenitors, the builders of Babel, most doubtless by their tower, have intended to rear the loftiest masthead in all Asia or Africa either, yet ere the final truck was put to it, as that great stone mast of theirs may be said to have gone by the board in the dread gale of God's wrath. Therefore, we cannot give these Babel builders priority over the Egyptians. I'm going to skip ahead, and here's the passage that I wanted over here. It may seem unwarrantable to couple in any respect the masthead standards of the land with those of the sea. But that, in truth, it is not so, is plainly evinced by an item for which Obed Macy, the sole historian of Nantucket, stands accountable. The worthy Obed tells us that in the early times of the whale fishery, airships were regularly launched in pursuit of the game. The people of that island erected lofty spars along the sea coast, to which the lookouts ascended by means of nailed cleats, something as fowls go upstairs in a henhouse. A few years ago, this same plan was adopted by the bay whalemen of New Zealand, who, upon descrying the game, gave notice to the ready-manned boats nigh the beach. But this custom has now become obsolete. Turn we then to one proper masthead, that of a whale ship. The 3 mastheads are kept manned from sunrise to sunset, the seamen taking their regular turns, as at the helm, and relieving each other every 2 hours. In the serene weather of the tropics, it is exceedingly pleasant. The masthead neigh to a dreamy, meditative man. It is delightful. There you stand, 100 feet above the silent docks, striding along the deep, as if the masts were gigantic stilts, while beneath you and between your legs, as it were, swim the hugest monsters of the sea, even as ships once sailed between the boots of the famous Colossus at Old Rhodes. There you stand, lost in the infinite series of the sea, with nothing ruffled but the waves. So it's a shift. So beautiful. It's a shift. The shift in perspective. I think a shift in perspective. Again, kind of taking us back to that cosmic perspective. It gives us the contemplative view, he says, would be another way to say that, right? Not the soldier on the front line, as it were, but the one in a position of elevation looking down from a dreamy kind of space. When pilots, there are pilots who fly at night, there's a word for this that I can't remember, but when they fly at night, sometimes they have a kind of hallucination, a feeling where the plane actually disappears and they feel like they're sitting on the wings of the plane, just moving through space. You kind of get that sense here, I think, for Melville as well, of this kind of double vision. And so if we want to put that in spiritual terms, to think about the mast as a metaphor for the human soul, which I think is where Katie started your question too. You know, it is the kind of the perspective of elevation of the human soul that exists inside of us, that we have these loftier abilities to see if we know how to access them. And they're quite important for navigating the waters. Yeah, the highest point, the top of the ship. Marilyn? Oh, Joe?
I did lower my hand.
Okay,
So-
Joe.
Thanks.
Yeah, the last paragraph in that chapter has this image of actually almost fall, that you could get lost metaphorically up there, and you could also get lost actually. You could lose your sense and fall. It's a very nice. But I raised my hand because I wanted to say something that's sort of different from what you've been doing. So I don't know how, okay. I'm always interested in structure. And in this book, I think looking at structure helps get at these really interesting philosophical questions that you're raising that are just obviously imminent in the text. But I was caught by the question of who is telling the story and who the narrator is. So to go back to that, I mean, he's Melville. I like the comment that he didn't die, that he's still alive at the end of the story. I always had assumed that too, so I would assume he survives. But he's a lot of people. And sometimes he's very funny. I thought in the beginning when he was describing how he and Queequeg became friends, or some of the stuff on the ship, it almost sounds like a boy's adventure novel. It's really kind of fun and, cute. And then it gets into these, I mean, I have a passage I don't really understand that I thought maybe we could look at. It gets really deep. And but I was going to say that who's telling the story, I think, is, and this is because I've read through 37, so it might be the bias of just where I am in the text, but it seems to me it's like, it's the narrator, it's Starbuck, it's Ahab, and that they all are these they're these really different principles. And I'm Freudian, so it's it's easy to see, Starbuck is this kind of super ego to Ahab's id, this kind of rush, this vengeance, this overcoming. And then that makes the narrator, I don't really think of him as Ishmael. I always forget that name. I don't even think of that name for him, which is interesting. But that makes him the ego. And we were talking, or you guys were talking, I looked at the recording last time about his being self-actualized or something, this so yeah,
Yeah.
not for a minute I thought I was talking about Ulrich and I had to like stop, but yeah, not going out into the street and knocking people's hats off methodically and whatnot, and that he really is a very realized person, and he has a kind of balance so far, and it's definitely in contrast to Ahab and Starbuck. But the passage was at the end of 33. And it's this weird, he's talking about Ahab. So this is on to Ahab and who Ahab is. And it's about his greatness.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know, maybe this is obscure. I don't know. But it was a place where I actually wrote, I don't know what this means. So
What can you read the
yeah,
sentence? I'll pull
I
it
would
up.
say, yeah, so he's talking about Ahab.
Mhm.
And it starts, the paragraph starts, nor perhaps will it fail to be eventually perceived that behind those forms and usages, as it were, he sometimes masked himself, incidentally making use of them for other and more private ends than they were legitimately intended to subserve. That certain sultanism of his brain. So this was he mentioned that before, that Ahab has like sultan-esque. He's the great man. He's the leader. He's beyond, and which I think once we get to, I guess it's 36 when he's talking, he sounds kind of whack when he's talking about the whale, and he actually, it seemed to me, loses that sense. But when he's silent and moving around the boat with that, leg, he's sultan-esque, and that certain sultanism of his brain, which had otherwise, in a good degree, remained unmanifested, through those forms, that same sultanism became incarnate in an irresistible dictatorship. And if already I'm starting to get a little, the boat is rocking for me. For be a man's intellectual superiority what it will, it can never assume the practical available supremacy over other men without the aid of some sort of external arts and entrenchments, always in themselves more or less paltry and base. So is he saying in order to have power over other men, you can't be too good, you have to have some sort of base qualities? I don't know. This it is that forever keeps God's true princes of the empire from the world's hustings. And hustings is political activity. I had to look it up. And leaves the highest honors that this air can give to those men who become famous more through their infinite inferiority to the choice hidden handful of the divine inert than through their undoubted superiority over the dead level of the mass. Okay, so I'm at sea. I don't know. Should I not be? And but anyway, the last one. Such large virtue lurks in these small things when extreme political superstitions invest them that in some royal instances, even to idiot imbecility, they have imparted potency. Now, we can all relate to that. Is that what he's talking about? But in the case of Nicholas, and so he goes on. Yeah. So it's obviously a little discursus on Ahab and his power, and he expands it into power in general, his observations about power. But is he saying, I said in a nutshell that to be truly powerful, you have to be weak. You can't be too good. You can't be all good and be truly powerful in the world. Is that?
Well, I have my musings. I'm curious if anyone else wants to venture a reading, though. Very small. Yeah, David, go for it.
Yeah, it's tying it's a great question. I'm tying it back to what you said about uncertainty. If we don't have God, we don't have the usual structures we're to see. I think Melville is playing with what do we have, and a lot of what we have in the book is each other, right? I mean, people from all sorts of countries and backgrounds are there in this kind of open, ruleless area, and it's in some ways just really beautiful. One of the things I caught on second readings is just how beautiful those passages are where the people are just working together. That little play that comes up, or drama that comes up in between where there's just dialogue between each other. But then also this passage that shows how easy it is for people in, democratic societies working together to be just led by a crazy person on a crazy cause. And certainly, you don't have to stretch the analogy too far to talk about our current times. But, that's another, when I first read the book, it was all the spiritual, philosophical, and reading it again, the politics of it, democracy versus authoritarianism come up a lot more. And it's throughout.
Yeah. But it is philosophical in the sense that the truly good man has no power, he seems to be saying, that to be truly good is to be impotent in the world. Which, is that just a very Protestant notion? Maybe, I don't know.
Someone can bring up Plato? Fine.
Well,
of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone else? This one. I think it was, maybe it's because David just talked, but I want to say I think it was King David who employed a man to just follow him around whenever he had to make public appearances. And the man's job was to whisper in his ear, "You are only a man. You are only a man." I think it was King David. Somebody can correct that. But the idea being that in order to keep power, one actually has to find some form of inner humility. Or I think of the Auden lines. What are they? Something like, the best are silent and the worst are, what's that line that's escaping?
I think that's, are you thinking of T.S. Eliot?
Oh, it is Eliot, isn't it?
Or no. Yates.
Of course it's Yates.
It's Yates.
Yates. That's why Yates is in my head. Gary, go for it.
No, I was just going to skip the poetry part. Just going back.
It's all
I think it's
all poetry, Terry.
Yes. Well, getting back, what I was going to say is that the passage we were looking at, it really just talks to me about the power of superstition and signs in terms of, creating dominance. It's not just the will, it's the latching on to something that leads people to believe that you're connected to something. Oops, sorry about that. effectively supernatural. And
Yeah.
it comes in different ways. I mean, just happen to be thinking of for various reasons. I mean, to think that going back a few years that Caroline Kennedy would make a great senator because her father had been president. I mean, what? I mean, where there's a natural inclination to basically follow sort of a superstitious instinct, or that there's some pattern, some knowledge or something in there that you can't really describe, but just is there in the air. Ahab, I mean, anyone on the boat could say, "Look, you're nuts. I'm not going anywhere near you." And let's have somebody else for captain. But for order, etc., wearing the title, it's having the title, that doesn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's part of it's a spoke off the larger conversation we've been having. I was looking for a different passage, but I opened to 124, 125, which I think also captures it. The one I want it comes a little bit later, but he says, come, Captain Bildad, stop palavering away. And with that, Peleg hurried him over the side, and both dropped into the boat. Ship and boat diverged. The cold, damp night breeze blew between. A screaming gull flew overhead. The two hulls wildly rolled. We gave three heavy-hearted cheers. And then this is the part that I underlined, blindly plunged like fate into the lone Atlantic. And then, this idea, then on the next page, the intolerable truth, what reflections were dependent on. O world, old world, the sea's landlessness. It's better to perish, such he says, but as in landlessness alone resides the highest truth. Shoreless, indefinite as God, so better is it to perish in that howling infinite than being gloriously dashed upon the lee, even if that were safety. Even if that were safety, for worm-like then, oh, who would craven crawl to land? Terrors of the terrible. Is all this agony so vain? Take heart, O Bulkington. Bear thee grimly, demigod. Up from the spray of thy ocean perishing, straight up leaps thy apotheosis. So Bulkington dies. But we have this tension in there, Terry, that I hear you pulling out too, which is a kind of critique of reason. And there's a more specific passage where he says something like, there's a point at which superstition is no longer considered idiotic, but becomes evidence of intelligence, right? It's a way of, touching to, I think it relates to Katie's question too, about the inner mast of the soul. There is something in certain forms of superstition that are a way of seeing that require a certain vantage point in order to enact, right? We're not talking about foolish superstitions. We're talking about
What page were you reading, Sam? What page? What page were you?
124 to 125. It was the last chapter of last paragraph of chapter 22, and then and then chapter 23, the lee shore. But yeah, and that also goes back to the conversation about the different religions. Right, Melville isn't going to just say, "Oh, that's a superstition," right? That he, in the Ramadan chapter, that he has to sit like that, that he's performing these rituals. For him, these are not things that are done in vain, right? And they're not to be mocked or made fun of either. They're ways of knowing that he respects. I'll tell you.
Yeah. Speaking about that in Bulkington, which is a very powerful I found it to be a very powerful chapter.
Yeah.
You were mentioning about whether he's going home or running away, and I was wondering about what connection that has to the whole story of Jonah, because when he's telling the story of Jonah, he's saying Jonah is running away, and he's running away from something, and then he ends up in the belly of the whale, right? And then that's when he is kind of transformed, and he kind of understands, reaches a level of understanding or his responsibility. But Bulkington is someone, that part I found very powerful, because Bulkington is someone who's like, he can't deal with land. The moment he's on land, he wants to go back again. And then this small part where Bildad, when they are out basically piloting them, and then he's about to leave the vessel for its journey out to sea, he's tearing up. And Peleg is, we're supposed to think, there is also tearing up, but he's hiding it better. And so I'm sitting there and thinking about the connection with that whole journey out to sea is something transformative, like that there's pain, there's loss, there's you'll get swallowed up by the whale, but it also has meaning, it has a transformative power, and Bulkington kind of representing that that ability to repeatedly go back through that journey over and over, as if that's the whole point of it all, and kind of echoing that journey of Jonah, except Jonah's, it's like one journey and then it's done, and then you're kind of, you know where you are. But maybe Melville is saying this is something you just have to do over and over and over again without end, and that is the only way to be, if you want to be a humble person, like Job, for example, and like embrace your own powerlessness.
I'm looking for, so Melville's critical of Bulkington. Right? I think we can say that. Bulkington is in a way contrasted with the, Starbuck and stuff, and it's on page so it's the last paragraph of chapter 27 before Ahab, and I think, but transformation is right, and I love the idea that it's this repetition, and that's where we begin in the first paragraph too, and in this November of the soul, and he says this is common to everyone. Everyone has to do this. This is not just something that I'm, so what does it mean to have to get yourself to see? At the end of this, we get our first mention of Pip. I was talking to a friend a few months ago, and he said to me, do you remember which leg Captain Ahab was missing? Terry, you want to answer?
Yeah, since no one knows me, I think the answer is the middle one.
A good Hegelian answer. Does anyone have an answer?
That was for the Freudians.
Melville never tells us. We actually don't know what leg Ahab is missing. He doesn't even tell us that. We get our first mention of Pip here. He says, they were nearly all, I'm just going to jump in halfway through the paragraph. They were nearly all islanders. It's the last two sentences. They were nearly all islanders in the Pequod, Isolatos too. I call such not acknowledging the common continent of men, but each Isolato living on a separate continent of his own. Yet now, federated along one keel, what a set these Isolatos were. And Anacharsis Coots' deputation from the isles of the sea, and all the ends of the earth, accompanying old Ahab in the Pequod to lay the world's grievances before that bar, from which not very many of them ever come back. Black little Pip, he never did. Poor Alabama boy. On the grim Pequod's forecastle, ye shall ere long see him, beating his tambourine, elusive of the eternal time, when sent for to the great quarter deck on high, he was bid strike in with angels, and beat his tambourine in glory, called a coward here, hailed a hero there. So not only is there, it's not, I don't want to put it that way, but part of the transformation, I think, is contained in that reflection that not many of them ever come back. One must set to sea. Whether that's a homecoming or a home leaving is a question. But whether or not there's any return from the voyage and where one is redeemed. What does it mean to be here on this plane, subject to earthly time? Whereas on the sea, as Freud well knew, among others, one experiences that eternal time. Pat, Chris?
Okay, I'll go first. Sam, just two questions. Your question about which leg, I had never thought of that, but it's a good question. But what's the possible significance of that? Number one. Number two, I didn't catch this, but this description about Pip, it says he's from Alabama. Now that's interesting because doesn't that imply that he was once a slave?
Yes, yes. We'll talk more about Pip later and what happens to Pip, who's lost at sea. But he's the great forgotten character of this book. The kind of the orphan character, the way he often gets written about. And I think when I read that sentence that I just read, I hear it both as, here he was somebody, but also in the way that he figures in, when he dies, there's something else too. And I think there are many possible reasons why Melville didn't bother to tell us. Melville didn't bother to tell us what leg Ahab was missing. Melville chose certainly not to tell us which leg Ahab was missing. And I don't want to answer that question right now, but I do think it's part of the rhetorical play that we, the reader, are pulled into, to go back to form. And I can spend more time talking about form next week if people want to get into the kind of lit crit notes. But go back to one thing that I brought up last week, which is the transition he makes from I to you to place emphasis on what it is that he's telling us, the reader, about and describing. So our narrator is also certainly not any kind of traditional narrator, whoever this Ishmael is. that we are following along. And I think it was maybe Terry who was making fun of me last week for my hatred of the narrator and the magic in the Magic Mountain, which is fine. I don't hate this narrator, Terry. But there's he switches from narration to jumping out of narration entirely, and we're still bound within a kind of linear narrative, cover to cover. We're being told a story, and the story is going to follow the journey of the Pequod, as Captain Ahab, of course, hunts the white whale. But the narrator is also going to switch tenses. It's going to assume a future position in order to talk about things that have come, even though by the time we're being told them, they've already happened. It's going to talk about things in the present tense as though they are unfolding. And we are getting that kind of bifurcated narrator who is both a character in the story that's being told and the author of the story that is being told. So he's recounting his own story in collusion with the other stories that he's telling us about as well. So one question that we haven't really talked about yet is, I wonder if Dylan got his kind of internal permission to switch tenses 3 times and like Tangled Up in Blue by reading Melville. That's my own question. But the question we haven't talked about yet is, what is the voice? What is the voice? What is the character of this narrator that we are following? What is his character? And how do you feel about him? Could ask it like that, but what is how is it that we are, not just how we're being led, but the question of who we're being led by. So it's certainly, so one characteristic, just to give you an example, we could easily say we have a very pedantic narrator. He likes to over-explain things. He likes to give us lots and lots of details. He likes to break things down. He wants to emphasize things to us. He wants us to know you, right? That would be one way to start that conversation. Pat, your mic's off.
As I was getting pulled deeper and deeper into Moby-Dick, I started thinking about this. It's a geometry concept called a fractal. Yeah. And it's a shape, and you start with these similar patterns, but you go deeper and deeper, and it's the same exact pattern. It's an ever repeating pattern. And so I just feel like I'm in a fractal as I'm reading Moby-Dick.
Yeah. Salman Rushdie has a nice line somewhere where he says a really good narrative is like a strand of hair that you hold between your fingertips and both hands, and you slowly spin it so that it reflects and refracts every texture and color in the single thread, right? To have the thread and to be able to spin it. And so there is that kind of kaleidoscopic feeling, I think, in the book as well. Some people argue because of that, that it's not even a novel. It just is a kind of compendium of different forms that have been.
And it also deals with this: we are of the world, in the world. But this ship is the same way. It's got its hierarchy. It's got its protocol. It's got its rules about who can, officers versus crew, and yeah. And I guess and then the last thing is that, whether we're getting away or coming home, And maybe the answer is neither. Wherever we are, we're going to be having that feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the question of place. I think it takes us back to the question of the mast too, and what our position is on the ship. Margaret?
Hi. Just quickly, I don't know if Melville ever read him, but wasn't Pip the main character in Great Expectations, Dickens' Great Expectations?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I thought of when I came upon his name. But I was just gonna say, what strikes me reading this, and in different ways in every chapter, but consistently, one of the few consistent things I would say of all the chapters I've read so far is, strangely enough, an incredibly cinematic approach. In that we're given the broad visuals with some close-ups, some pullbacks. If this was written today, it would be the manuscript would be sort of tacked out in terms of what the shots would be. And it just strikes me as funny given when he wrote this.
It would be tapped out in, what did you say?
That how the different shots of the different visuals, discussions,
Yeah.
viewpoints, and the like would be shown. So, which is interesting because in one of the earlier chapters, when the narrator says he wants to go to sea and he's shown the sea and there's nothing there, because he says he wants to go to see the world, and then is mockingly shown the sea and asks, well, what do you see there? And it's just water as far as he can see. So anyway, that's it.
Yeah, I don't know if I would have to look up the relationship between the two. In the book I have been writing on loneliness, I talk about the two Pips a little bit. And Dickens, who is writing around the same time. And I think that there are some literary overlaps there in terms of the kind of orphan character. And thinking about loneliness and death, which is just how I was approaching it. Yeah, Moby Dick was written before Great Expectations. I would assume, but I'd have to look. I don't know the literary history, who read who when, as it were. It is cinematic. I've never seen a film adaptation of Moby Dick. There certainly are film adaptations of Moby Dick that you can watch. And it is another way to say that, I would say, would be to say that it's visual. Part of the great beauty of this book is how, we were talking last week, how it brings us in. And part of that is the visual richness and the descriptive detail that we get, which is why certain details that are missing stand out all the more so. Right? If we're going to get a two-page description of a single harpoon, but we don't get to know which leg Ahab is missing. There is a question of why, and a kind of assumption there, but it's a very physical book. I think I would say that as well. I read it as a very physical book. There's a lot of appeal to the senses throughout it as well. Isabella?
All right. I sort of have my own comment about the cinematic novel thing, which that initially, upon hearing that comment, I found it to be a bit curious. Because at least in the analyses I've heard of cinematic novel, it has been a little bit derogatory in the sense that cinematic novel refers to and over focus on the physical action rather than actually taking advantage of the novel's insight into thought and pondering and emotions and all that. But Moby Dick, as we know, is a very ponderous novel.
Mm-hmm.
So I found it interesting to have cinematic applied to that because of the strength of its visuals.
Yeah. Yeah, that's nice. Thinking about what the novel is as a vehicle in the 19th century as well. You know, the novel really comes into form in the 19th century. Both in that sense of ponderous that you just used, which is really lovely, and in the sense that it kind of creates a space for an inner dialogue to be had between the reader and the text on the page as a kind of invitation to the work. Many of the first English novels were really moral vehicles for that reason. Right? By opening up that inner dialogue of thought between the self and the text, one could change the inner moral character of man. That was the promise of the novel, initially, at least. Marilyn, you get the last comment, note, question, reflection for this evening.
I just wanted to say that I watched the 1956 film with Gregory Peck, and
Gregory Peck? Okay.
It was really, really good. I thought, I mean, it was Hollywoodized for sure, but I thought a lot of the scenes were, as the point was said, cinematically capturing the text. So I think it's worth watching.
So some of you who've been, I go for it. You want to watch it, go for it. I would suggest we even have a movie. I am afraid to watch a cinematic rendering of Moby-Dick because the book is such a thing that lives in my head. I kind of want to protect my own inner film. You know, but I'm also very superstitious about these things. Like I still haven't finished Robinson Crusoe, by the way, because I'm afraid of what's going to happen to the guy after they get him off the island. So, you know, I just keep stopping at the same spot. And I like, as somebody said to me recently, he's like, oh, good. So you're just leaving him stranded there. That's what you're choosing to do instead, which is fine. But I have to get around things in my own imagination.
I think you're right because it does take away your imagery from your imagination. I will say that for sure. I mean, you have to, then you have a conflict. Is it the visual or is it the imagined?
Well, the two are related to one another, and I'm very tempted to begin talking about Hannah Arendt and thinking and Kant and Proust, but I'm going to resist the urge to do so because I have to teach a class on Yeats and the occult in 30 minutes for the Brooklyn Institute. But this was really lovely. I did not get to read you the letter, show you the letter that that Melville sent to Nathaniel Hawthorne in 1851. But I will send that in the recording for tomorrow and the scenes either. If there's anything you really want to talk about next week, let me know. If you want to talk more about form, we can certainly do that as well too, if there's anything specifically. Okay. Last thoughts, questions? To see back to, feels like we're going back to see.
I would just have certainly said theatrical more than cinematic, especially given all the drama around the first appearance of Ahab, and then we even get the stage directions enter Ahab.
Yeah. Well, so there are going to be whole chapters that are also written as scripts, as theatrical scripts, which is where we'll pick up one and then another. We'll pick up next week too. And yes, I mean we can write a catalog of the list of forms that Melville's playing with in each chapter too. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Sam. That's great.
Farewell. Thank you. It was fun. Thank you.